Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm Aaron Moss, and over the next couple of hours, we're going to cover everything you need to know to launch your first online study. Or if you're already using online tools, we're going to cover some things that will help you improve the studies that you're already conducting. Now, at the start, I want to mention that everything we're going to talk about today is covered in this open access textbook that my colleagues and I have written. It's called Research in the Cloud, an Introduction to Modern Methods in Behavioral Science. This is a book that's being published by Cambridge University Press. We expect it to be out later this summer. But in the meantime, you can find a full preview along with all kinds of additional resources we've created on our website. So if you scan this QR code or you go to the CloudResearch website and you look under resources, you'll find a full, nice, pretty preview of this book. And we really do two things in this book. It starts off by teaching people basic methods of behavioral science and social science research. And then the second part of this is a guide to conducting online research. So if you want deeper information about the things that we talk about today, or you'd like to sit down and read through some of these things, look at the sources, this book is a great resource. And again, it's free and open access. So here's a roadmap for what we're going to cover in today's workshop. We're going to start off by talking about online research and why it matters and what it allows us to study about people. Then we'll move into comparing some of the platforms that are used to recruit online research participants. And during this phase of the workshop, I hope that you see that where you collect data online matters a lot more than most people realize. Then during the heart of the workshop, we're going to talk about data quality. As I'm sure many of you know, data quality is the #1 challenge in online research. And for that reason, we're going to spend time on it because getting this step wrong can not only lead to incorrect conclusions, but it can invalidate your entire study. It can mean that your time and your effort and your resources are wasted. After we talk about data quality, we'll take a short break. And when we come back from that break, I'll do a live demo of how to set up and launch a study on the Connect platform. And I'll do this so you can see exactly how the process of conducting an online study works. After we go through that demo, we'll have a nice chunk of time for a question and answer session, where I'd be happy to answer questions you have about any of the concepts we learned about throughout the webinar, or specific questions that apply to your research and how to launch a study. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the content. So by the end of today's workshop, I hope everyone has kind of the knowledge and the ability to do 5 things. First, I want you to understand the ecosystem for online participant recruitment. And the goal is for you to really understand where participants come from in these online platforms and why that decision of where to recruit people matters for your research. The second important goal is for everyone to be able to identify some of the main threats to data quality. So we'll talk about fraud that comes from human research participants. We'll talk about click farms and the problem that they pose to data quality. And then we'll, once we understand the threats to data quality, we'll talk about some basic strategies to protect the data you collect online. So we'll go through things like attention check questions. I'll explain a little bit about how we use benchmarking questions to make sure the questions that we develop to measure attention are actually working properly. You could use the same strategy for developing some of your own. And we'll talk a little bit about these kind of practical ways you can implement the strategy in your own data collection. The fourth thing I want everyone to leave this webinar with is an ability to navigate the user interface of a platform like Connect. I want you to understand what's required to launch an online study and how to be successful doing it. And then perhaps most importantly, by the end of today's webinar, I'd like everyone to have the knowledge to make informed decisions about which platform is best suited for different kinds of research projects. Really walking through this sort of decision tree understanding the strengths and weaknesses of different platforms, and how to make sure you give yourself the best odds of being successful is one of the goals of a lot of what we do at Cloud Research, including a webinar like this. All right, so along the way today, I have a number of kind of polling questions that are meant to be more interactive. When we get to the question and answer session, you can certainly put questions into the chat or into the question and answer, but we should also be able to, if everyone would like, you should be able to turn on your microphone and have kind of a back and forth. So there's some elements of today's workshop that are meant to be interactive. But as we get started, let's begin by talking about what's possible with online research and why it is so important today. So I want to start off by talking about the scale of online research. And I'm going to do that by asking everyone a very simple question. How many surveys do you think participants completed online last year? So think about all around the world, all the research that's being conducted in fields like academia and market research, polling and public opinion, things like public health, everyone who's relying on online sources for data. Take maybe 15, 20 seconds here, just mentally come up with a number for how many surveys you think participants completed online last year. All right, so hopefully everyone has come up with some kind of guess. The answer is in the ballpark of 5 billion. So each year right now, somewhere close to 5 billion online surveys are being completed. Now, 5 billion is, of course, just a really big number. That represents a staggering amount of data to be gathering about human beings online. But what I think makes this number more remarkable than just its large size is that if you go back 15 years or so to 2010 or 2011, this number was close to zero. And that's because in 2010 and 2011, online survey tools were just emerging. And so in the last 15 years, we've seen this revolution and how social and behavioral scientists collect data about human beings. And this revolution in data collection has affected researchers in every discipline and field that relies on data from people. So a lot of people are familiar with this change. You've, of course, heard about it. You're in a webinar where you're interested in online data collection. But I don't think most people fully realize how complete this transformation has been or how quickly it's happened. In several disciplines within kind of academic social and behavioral sciences, there are papers that suggest somewhere between 60 to 70, or in some fields, 80% of the data being published now comes from online sources. Then there are multi-billion-dollar per year industries like market research that are interested in understanding consumers, what they think of different brands and products, how they evaluate even the packaging that goes into a product. And the vast majority of that research, again, in the ballpark of 70 to 80% of all research being done, is conducted online today. If you look at a polling aggregator like the 538 website that tracks approval of Congress and the president and looks at kind of the horse race of presidential or congressional specific races, about 70 to 80% of the data that goes into those aggregated polls comes from online sources. Then these online tools are also important in areas like health and behavioral health studies. They're used for policy research. They're used for product development and user experience research. So they really touch on every area that relies on data from human beings. And the reasons why this transformation has occurred and why it's been so quickly, there's a number of benefits that most people are pretty familiar with or have some exposure to. So of course, online data collection is much faster than offline data collection. A study that might take weeks or months in the laboratory can be completed online, usually in a matter of hours. Not only is online research faster, but it gives researchers access to a much more diverse pool of participants. If you've ever collected data at a college or university or in your local community, you know that you're often limited to only people who are convenient and easy to access. It limits the demographics of the people that you can sample. Online, however, you can easily set up a study and recruit people from all around the world. You can easily target people from different demographic groups, and overall, the pool of people available is much more diverse. Right? But the third kind of important benefit that sometimes gets overlooked is that online research is much more flexible. It allows us to study questions about people and their behavior in ways that are just much more difficult offline. And the best way to illustrate what I mean is to give you an example. So early in 2025, OpenAI, who's the company behind ChatGPT, ran a large longitudinal study on our CloudResearch Connect platform. This was done with some researchers from MIT, and they wanted to understand how people's daily use of ChatGPT affects their social and emotional well-being and their feelings about important relationships in their lives. So what these researchers did is they recruited 1,000 participants from Connect, and they gave them access to ChatGPT. This was a randomized controlled trial. So some of the participants were asked to talk about different topics with ChatGPT, and others were asked to engage in different modes of conversation. Some were text-based, some were verbal, where they used talk to text to have different kinds of conversations. What you can see in this infographic is that at the end of this 28-day study, so participants interact with ChatGPT every day for 28 days in a row. At the end of each conversation, they fill out a daily questionnaire. There are weekly questionnaires looking at mental health, and there's a large pre-survey and post-survey measurement as well. At the end of this 28-day period, the participants had logged almost 32,000 conversations with ChatGPT and recorded almost 1,500 hours of audio. So this is a great example of what I mean by flexibility. This is a large longitudinal study looking at real-world behavior outside of the laboratory context that would be basically impossible to conduct in person. To bring 1,000 people into the laboratory would be its own challenge, let alone to follow them for 28 days in a row. The logistical challenges would just be too complex. And so online tools make it easier to access participants, to get them to do more complicated things that allow us to answer bigger, more kind of complicated questions about behavior. So online research today has, I think, really delivered on a lot of its earliest promises. It's incredibly commonly used. The data that researchers are gathering from these online platforms is valuable, and it's flexible in a way that allows us to answer different kinds of questions about human behavior than if we were limited to interacting with people face to face. But that doesn't mean that online research isn't without some challenges, and we'll get to a few of those in just a minute. Before we do, though, I want to ask a couple of questions to just help get a better sense of who's in the webinar today and people's level of experience with online research. So I'm going to present a couple of poll questions that should show up in the chat. And these are questions that you can answer just by clicking on either yes or no, again, within the chat section. So if you look at the toolbar across the top, you should see a chat icon. If you click on that, I'm going to go ahead and launch the first question here. If it doesn't pop up on your screen, again, you should find it in the chat section. But the first question is simply, have you ever collected online data before? Give a little bit of time so everyone has a chance to weigh in. All right, so you should see the results sort of populate as people answer. And it looks here that most people in the webinar have experience with online research. And that's great. Hopefully the things that we covered today, even though this is meant as a beginner workshop, hopefully they teach you some new things that help you conduct even more successful research. If you haven't conducted online studies before, today is a great introduction, as we've talked about, for understanding the options and getting to the stage where you're ready to conduct your own study. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and launch the second question now, which is, have you ever taken part in online studies as a research participant? Again, I'll give a little bit of time so everyone has a chance to weigh in with an answer here. Similar to the last question, it looks like most people are saying yes to this as well. And that's really great to see. One of the first steps we recommend people take as they're getting started with online research is to sign up as a participant yourself and to participate in a number of studies. There are a number of benefits to this. You can first understand how the platform operates, how participants that you launch a study to are going to find your study, what they're going to experience when they actually participate. But participating in studies also gives you the opportunity to see what it looks like when a study is engaging, what it looks like when a study is exciting to participate in, versus what it looks like when a study is very dull or unengaging. And understanding that sort of participant experience helps you when you're conducting your own online research to really think about, what are participants going to experience and do in my study? And what's a way that I can capture their interest and keep them engaged? All right, so this third question, set up a multiple choice item that allows you to click yes or no. This is an open-ended one where you should be able to type an answer. What is your biggest concern or question about online research? As people submit these open-ended items, we should get a word cloud here that allows us to see what kinds of themes are coming up. Okay, I see a lot of different themes popping up here. I see questions about data quality and bots. I see things about screeners, people skipping questions, making sure people's responses are authentic. I saw something about attrition, so maybe somebody running a longitudinal study. We'll touch on a number of these different things, certainly questions about data quality. When we get into the Connect demo, I can show you some of the different options for screening participants, finding people from the right demographic groups. But keep some of these topics in mind for the question and answer session later on. If we don't cover something that you're interested in along the way, it'd be great to have you remind me of that when we get to the question and answer. I'd be happy to dive into that topic in more detail then. So let's go ahead and turn to the second part of the workshop, which is understanding the options for where to recruit participants online. In this workshop, we're going to focus on the two main sources of paid participant recruitment online, which are market research panels and what we call researcher-centric platforms. There are, of course, other ways beyond these paid sources of recruitment to gather data. Sometimes people use participants from a university or community-run subject pool, and they either recruit people in person or send out a survey online. People can sometimes recruit using social media, or if you have connections to an organization, such as a business or a school, people sometimes send out surveys to an email list. Again, the two sources that we're going to focus on here are market research panels and researcher-centric platforms. And we're going to focus on those two because they're the most commonly used sources for online participant recruitment. Now, market research panels and what we call researcher-centric platforms really represent two different worlds of online data collection. These two platforms are fundamentally different ecosystems. They were built differently. They had different audiences of researchers in mind initially, and they function differently. So we're going to walk through some of these differences between these two to understand both their strengths and weaknesses, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to decide which one is right for the study you're interested in conducting. As we go along, you'll see that the differences between these platforms really affect everything about online research. The differences between these platforms are going to affect data quality, how good you can expect the data to be kind of at a baseline level. They're going to affect the overall cost that you pay for your study. The differences between these platforms are going to affect who you can target or actually sample in your study. And they're even going to affect what kind of study you can conduct, the different activities you can get participants to engage in when you run an online study. So let's start with market research panels. There are a number of different companies that you could call or identify as a market research panel. Some of the really big ones that people are familiar with are Lucid, which was later acquired by Cint, Dynata, but there are really hundreds of these different panels that operate in this area. And these market research panels are often not a single source of participant. They are what we call aggregations of hundreds of different participant platforms, all kind of piled together into these massive pools or marketplaces that are used for research. So as a result of this kind of pulling together all these different participant sources into this aggregated panel, market research panels have tens of millions, or in some cases, hundreds of millions of participants completing studies around the world each year. So when we said earlier that there are about 5 billion surveys being completed online each year right now, the vast majority of those surveys are being completed on these market research panels. So when a company wants to know what consumers think about a new product, or when a political organization wants to poll likely voters to understand what they think about a candidate or a policy, they typically turn to one of these market research panels. Right? Again, compared to offline data collection, these online platforms offer fast data collection. They offer the ability to target people from very specific demographic groups. And because these market research panels operate internationally, you can sample in about 150 countries around the world. The process of using one of these market research panels means specific things for data collection. So often the researcher will set up their own study in Qualtrics or some kind of survey platform. And in some limited cases, they might go into one of these platforms and set up the study themselves and kind of manage the data collection. But much more often what happens is the researcher shares the link to their survey with the company who helps them collect the data. This method of data collection means that the company determines how much participants are going to be compensated for completing the study. It also means that the company is the one managing the data collection, and often they let the researcher know when they've reached some target sample size and when things in the study are wrapping up. There are a number of strengths and weaknesses to this mode of data collection. One strength of these market research panels is their size or their scale. It's possible to recruit thousands, tens of thousands, or in some cases, even hundreds of thousands of participants at once. One study example that stuck with me over time that I like to give as an example, during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were some researchers at the New York Times, part of their Upshot blog, who wanted to study where participants were, or where people were wearing masks around the country and where they weren't. And they recruited over, I think, 200,000 participants in like a 2-week period using these market research panels. So the size is really, really large. As we said, compared to offline sources, this online data collection is fast. You can often gather responses from 5,000 or 10,000 people within a matter of hours or days. But the real strength of these market research panels is their demographic targeting. So if you're a researcher and you want to find people who own a certain type of car, people who live in a particular or specific US zip code, or people who have a specific medical condition, you can often screen through people in these online platforms until you find what we would refer to as a needle in a haystack, right? You can find these characteristics that maybe only 1, 2, 3, or 4% of the overall population have. And because you can screen through enough people, you can end up with a sample of a couple hundred people who meet some very specific targeting criteria and then have them take a study. Another strength of these market research panels is their sort of representativeness. So you can use quotas to represent all kinds of different characteristics in the population as a whole. But because of their size, these market research panels have more participants who are in their 50s and 60s, sometimes even in their 70s. And there's all these characteristics that correlate with age that make them kind of just more representative of the country as a whole. So you find more political diversity in people's opinions and party affiliation in these market research panels. You find people who are more religious compared to some of the other online sources. With people who are in their 50s and 60s, you find a different family composition and all kinds of characteristics that might correlate with age. And overall, again, just the idea is it's more of a broad swath of the population as a whole. So these market research panels are good for really big studies that need a lot of participants, for really refined demographic targeting, but their weakness really comes down to problems with data quality. That at a baseline level, if you just conduct a study in one of these market research panels, you can expect somewhere between 30 and 40% of the participants that you gather data from to provide low quality or problematic data. All right, so this is data that comes from people who might be lying in response to questions that you ask, people who are not paying attention, or as we'll talk about in a few minutes, people who are committing fraud. Another limitation of these market research panels is a direct result of this kind of aggregation that helps make them so big. So because there are participants who are being pulled together from many different online research sites that are used for research, there's a lot of turnover in these platforms. And it makes it harder to conduct studies that require what we call high engagement. Anything that goes beyond about 25 minutes or so of commitment from the participant becomes difficult in these online platforms. And conducting the kind of longitudinal or daily diary study that I gave an example of earlier with the ChatGPT study, that would basically be impossible in these market research panels. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the reasons why when we look at the researcher-centric platforms. All right, so researcher-centric platforms are exactly what they sound like. Platforms where researchers are in control and really the center of the research. So these are platforms like CloudResearch Connect and some of its competitors that were specifically built for social and behavioral science research. Maybe the exception to that would be Mechanical Turk. So as I said, just as the name of these platforms would suggest, they're really built around researchers and putting researchers in control of the studies that they conduct. So overall, these researcher-centric platforms are smaller than the market research panels. Often these researcher-centric sites have somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people taking studies per year. At CloudResearch, we have a kind of long history of working with these platforms. We have our own Connect participant platform. Before that, we did a lot of work with Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and we've published a number of different papers looking at the number of people who participate in studies here each year. And so there's a number of good resources out there showing it's in this 100 to 200,000 per person year ballpark. One of the main differences between these researcher-centric platforms and market research panels comes down to data quality. Because these researcher-centric platforms are smaller, it allows platforms that want to invest the time and the resources to actually vet every single participant who signs up. When people sign up as a participant on our Connect platform, they have to go through an identity verification process where they submit a government ID along with a selfie to verify this is a real person and these two documents match up. Then they have to go through an entire onboarding process where they complete different measures of attention and quality. If you want to see what this process looks like, you can sign up as a participant on Connect yourself and complete a few studies. You'll get a look at some of the measures that we put people through. Beyond differences in kind of how well vetted participants are or the overall sort of quality, these researcher-centric platforms give researchers control over studies that matter in a number of ways for the kinds of research that you can conduct. So one of these tools is that researchers they go in, they set up their own study, and they manage the data collection. But in addition to kind of doing that work, there's a direct ability to communicate with the participants. This means that you can send basically email messages to participants if there's some kind of problem in the study as they're conducting it. Maybe there's a broken link or something that doesn't make sense to them, something they can't access or they can't do that you've asked them to do. They can actually communicate with you and tell you about the problem and allow you the opportunity to solve it. Much more often where these communication tools are valuable is in reminding people about follow-up waves in a longitudinal or some kind of daily diary study. You can really increase retention rates by reminding people a month after the initial study that a second wave of data collection is getting ready to launch, and then following up with them after that study's live. Another really important component of getting participants to do a wider set of things, really maintaining data quality, is that researchers are also in control of how much participants are going to be compensated for participating in the research. So not only can researchers go in and decide how much any one study is going to pay, but you can set up different ways to give people bonuses based on their performance in a study. You can decide that if people are in a longitudinal study where there are multiple waves of data collection, let's say they complete 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5, you can offer them some kind of incentive-based bonus to really try to maximize people's engagement and make sure they're going to follow up. And overall, these researcher-centric platforms, because you're in control of all these different features, allow for a level of engagement that you just can't get with market research panels. So we've already covered a number of examples, like the ChatGPT study, right? 28 days in a row, having people come back over and over again, filling out different surveys or having an interaction. But it's also possible to run video interviews on a platform like Connect. It's possible we have researchers who run mock jury trials, where participants need to go through both sides of a actual court case. They need to watch videos, read documents. This might take an hour to an hour and a half to go through both sides. And then they need to render some kind of verdict about who they think is at fault and how much and damages they might award. These are really important studies where it takes a long time for people to work through both sides of this case, but it's really important that people also pay attention and provide high quality data. You can get participants on a site like Connect to engage with these kinds of projects because you can explain exactly what you need from them, and then you can give them an amount of money or compensation that makes them interested in the study. So in this hour to an hour and a half long study that's really intense, people might make $25 or so. Having control over that compensation really helps find participants who are motivated to complete difficult projects like this. And there are a number of different studies and published papers out there comparing data quality in these online sources as a result of the vetting that participants do not only when they sign up, but that a number of platforms do kind of continuously as people participate in these studies. You often find that there are about 5% or less of participants who are providing what we call these problematic or low quality responses in these researcher-centered platforms on average. So sort of at a baseline level, if you launch a study in these two different ecosystems, you're going to see big differences in data quality. That doesn't mean that you can't do some things to improve data quality from one source or the other. And it's important to realize that it's not as simple as thinking that one of these platforms is better for online research than another. At CloudResearch, we actually offer access to both options. We have a product that's called Prime Panels that allows researchers to sample from these market research panels. And we have our own Connect platform, which is one of these leading researcher-centric platforms. We spend a lot of time communicating with researchers about the strengths and the weaknesses of these different platforms so that people can make informed decisions about which one is best for their study. And that overall framework for thinking through which platform is best suited to your particular study is something that we call the fit for purpose framework. So what it means is considering what the goals of your study are, who it is you're trying to sample, what it is that you're asking them to do, and what the question that you're ultimately interested in answering is. You then consider the strengths and the weaknesses of these different sample sources, and you make decisions that give you the best odds of being successful. So if you want to sample people from multiple international countries and do some kind of cross-cultural comparison, market research panels are the types of platforms that make that sort of data collection possible. If you want to run a study that requires a really high level of engagement from participants, the researcher-centric platforms are probably going to be the best bet. Before we get into a few questions to help us think through this fit for purpose framework and which website or which site might be best for different kinds of studies, I'll quickly just pause to ask if there are any questions about these platforms before we look again at a couple of questions that help us think through this. If so, you can feel free to add them into the chat or the question and answer section. I don't see any questions coming through, so I'll go ahead and get to a few more of these polling questions that help us think through these differences in platforms. Okay, so in the chat section, again, you should see these polling questions pop up. First question is, which platform do you think is best suited for a short survey that needs a large sample with pretty broad demographic groups? Would it be best to run this kind of study on a market research panel or a researcher-centric platform? There are a number of results, and it looks like overwhelmingly about 80% of people are saying market research panels. So I put this question first because it's actually a good illustration of how your goals matter. Certainly the way I just described market research panels is that they are good, well suited for large surveys with broad demographics. But you can actually gather pretty large samples from these researcher-centric platforms as well. And because there are such big differences in data quality between these two sources, we would actually recommend researcher-centric platforms as kind of the first stop for a large survey like this, unless there are really, it's a really, really large sample, let's say like 10,000 people. And the reason why is that, again, data quality matters a lot here. Let's say you're conducting some kind of poll or descriptive research project. You want to know what percentage of people have experience with some product, or what percentage of people think something about a politician or some kind of approval. Unless you have really good measures of data quality, This kind of study can very easily be misleading in a market research panel. In the book that I mentioned, we actually have several examples of real research projects that gathered completely misleading results because of problems with data quality in these online platforms. So this is a study that you could run in either place, but because of those baseline differences in data quality, we would kind of make the first stop these researcher-centric platforms, unless there are some good theoretical reasons to think you can't represent the groups that you're very interested in using quotas or something, or if the sample size was just really large and it would be a difficult thing to gather quickly on a researcher-centric site. All right, so that's just an example of, I think, in real time, kind of that fit for purpose framework, thinking about what the goal of the project is, what the strengths and weaknesses of the platform are, and considering how data quality might affect what you find. All right, so I'll go ahead and launch the second question here, which is which platform should be used for some kind of experiment or a more complicated task, a market research panel or a researcher-centric site? Right, so it looks like everyone has clearly received this message that researcher-centric platforms are really best for more complicated studies. This doesn't mean that you can't conduct some kind of short experiment or A/B test on a market research panel. You certainly can. But as the test gets more complex, or as the thing that you're asking participants to do becomes more complicated, researcher-centric sites are just going to be a much better fit. We have people that use our products from all kinds of different areas of the social and behavioral sciences. And a lot of times there might be researchers in cognitive psychology who want participants to kind of download some software that involves quick reactions to different stimuli that are presented on the screen. And we find that participants in market research panels are not willing to download those kinds of experiments or to engage in something more complicated like that at a very high rate. You find many more people in researcher-centric platforms who are willing to do that kind of task. But you certainly can present, a short product packaging sort of experiment, again, like an A/B test in a market research panel. But as the experiment gets more complex, or as people need to engage with the survey or the study more, researcher-centric platforms end up being a better fit. Which platform should be used to recruit a specific or niche sort of sample? So it's interesting that in response to this question, most people are saying researcher-centric platforms. Targeting specific samples is actually one of the main strengths of market research panels. So targeting different groups of participants ends up being a little bit more of a complicated topic. There's some nuance to it. You certainly can find some participants from rare groups on researcher-centric platforms. And there's a number of different ways to go about that sort of targeting. We'll talk about that when we get to the Connect demo. But often, if you need a really large group of people that is a smaller share of the overall population, this is one of the strengths of market research panels, finding that kind of needle in a haystack sample. And when you do that, there's then a number of things you want to do to really verify the identity or the characteristics that those participants are reporting. So finding or recruiting specific groups of participants is really one of the strengths of market research panels. And there's some ability to do that in researcher-centric platforms. It just often ends up meaning that the researcher has a smaller overall sample size to work with. All right, the last question here. Which platform should be used for some kind of longitudinal or daily diary study that has a follow-up component with participants? All right, looks like people are very clearly responding that this is a strength of researcher-centric platforms, which is absolutely true. So I like a lot of these questions because they give me a chance to talk about, where this answer that might be obvious or that people have come up with applies and where it doesn't apply. This doesn't mean that you can't conduct any kind of longitudinal research on a market research panel. You can conduct some longitudinal research there. Often the follow-up period is limited, the shorter the better, but somewhere between a week and a month, and you might expect retention rates of maybe 40 or 50%. And the longer that gap between the initial survey and any kind of follow-up gets, the lower the retention rate. What's different about researcher-centric platforms is that if you had about a 1-month gap between the initial survey and the follow-up, you could expect a retention rate of about 75% or so, depending on things like how much you compensate people and if you follow some best practices for follow-up reminders. Where the real difference in longitudinal capability or tracking or kind of daily diary follow-up with people becomes really, really clear is in these intense longitudinal studies, the kind like the ChatGPT example, where people need to do something for 28 days in a row, or we've run studies in these online platforms where people need to do things for, say, 36 weeks in a row. And we've had people who come back consistently to engage in these long and difficult tasks because of all those tools that I mentioned. You're able to explain very clearly by communicating with participants what they need to do. You're able to award bonuses or an increasing set of incentives that if you complete this survey, you get $1. If you come back next week, you get $2, right? So an increasing series of rewards to give people incentives. And then you can also use the email system to send reminders. Let's say a follow-up study goes live at 12 o'clock on Friday. Let's say 40% of people complete it almost immediately within a couple of hours. You can then use the email system to remind people who might be straggling over the next day or 2 days to finish up that last wave of data collection. And all these tools together make the retention on these market research panels very, very good and a great place to run any kind of longitudinal or daily diary sort of tracking study with participants. All right, so just one reminder as we talk about the differences between these online platforms. At CloudResearch, we really do emphasize this point that the choice between platforms that you would use to recruit participants is not about some platforms being good and some research platforms being bad. It's really more about fit for purpose. What is the goal of your study? Who is it that you're looking to sample? What do those participants need to do? And how long do you need their time and attention for? Of course, other things like the budget you have and the amount of time you have to oversee the project, or even the ease of just collecting the data. All those things matter too. But we recommend by thinking through this decision tree, by clearly stating what your goals are, and then looking at the strengths and weaknesses of these platforms to find which one is best suited for your project. All right, so that's a little bit about online research, how it's being used today, how it's why it's important and what it allows researchers to do, and then an overview of the 2 main types of participant recruitment platforms that are commonly used for research. Now we'll move into part 3, which is about data quality. So this is really the heart of today's workshop. And that's because data quality is the single biggest challenge in online research. As researchers, if we get this step wrong, almost nothing else about the study matters. The results that we gather could be completely meaningless if we have a bunch of bad data. Or I would argue even worse, the data could be misleading. And again, in the textbook that we've written, we gathered all these examples of how researchers gathering data from different online sources were completely misled about their findings or what was going on with people and behavior because of problems with data quality. And so I really recommend, if you're interested in how easily people can be misled or how some of these different findings could have implications for society as a whole or what we think about behavior, checking out some of those examples. I also just want to emphasize that in today's workshop or webinar, we're really going to cover data quality at an introductory sort of level, understanding what some of the problems are and going over a set of strategies for how to measure data quality. If you want a lot more details about data quality, where some of these problems are, research that we've done into this issue, and looking at the newest threat of AI agents, I recommend that you sign up for our Data Quality Masterclass, which is a workshop we're going to offer next Thursday. You can find that on the CloudResearch website. But let's start off talking about data quality by just understanding how big the problem is. I said earlier that in market research panels, somewhere between 30 and 40% of participants provide low quality data. You might wonder, where does that number come from? What's the evidence for that 30 to 40%? We're going to go through a couple of different examples that operate at different levels of the sort of online research ecosystem. We'll look at people's responses to a specific question, then we'll look at an entire platform, and then we'll look at the entire ecosystem of market research panels. All right, so the first example here is just looking at people's responses to one single question in a study that our team at CloudResearch conducted with market research panels. We asked people if they had recently purchased a home in this town called McMullen, Alabama. This was a simple yes or no question. So we ran a survey with one of these commonly used market research panels. We were interested in questions of data quality and kind of validating some of the measures that we were using. And we asked people just this very simple question. Again, have you recently purchased a home in McMullen, Alabama? What most of our participants presumably did not know is that McMullen, Alabama is a town that, according to the latest US Census in 2020, has a population of just 32 people. Right, so 32 people in the entire town. That means that we should really see a response rate of 0. Almost everyone should say no to this question in an online research platform. In response to this incredibly simple question, we actually see that about 20% of participants say yes to this question where we know the answer has to be no. And when we run studies with multiple what we call yay-saying questions like this, and we look at people who fail more than one of these items, we usually see somewhere above 30% of people failing very simple attention check questions like this. All right, so this is one piece of evidence for the kind of the scope of this data quality problem. We can ask participants online a number of questions like this, where the answer, right, statistically and overwhelmingly has to be no, and we see a very high percentage who will say yes to questions like this. If we go up another level, though, remove from a specific question within one study, our team at CloudResearch actually has published a number of papers where we look at an entire platform over a period of, let's say, a year to 2 years. And we see how many participants in that ecosystem are failing questions like this within a survey, how many we can mark as being, unreliable, providing low quality data. And several years ago, when we worked closely with Amazon's Mechanical Turk, we actually did this sort of platform level vetting of participants. Over a period of about a year and a half, our team had over 165,000 participants who completed a number of different surveys that we were conducting. And those surveys were really focused on measuring data quality, finding out who provides reliable quality responses and who provides low quality data, failing the kinds of questions that I just gave you an example of. What we found after vetting those participants for over a year was that 65,000 out of the 165,000 people that we surveyed provided unusable or low quality data. Again, failing questions where the answer was very obvious. Overall, that's a rate of about 40% of participants on Mechanical Turk at the time that we were conducting these studies. Right? And again, these weren't people who were just providing low quality data. Across a number of different measures, their data was completely unusable. Right? And then the third sort of example of where this number of 30 to 40% comes from is a number of studies that have been conducted by professionals in the market research industry. So there's this group called Case for Quality that several years ago set out to conduct a study where they just simply wanted to describe how big the problem with data quality was in online platforms. This was something that a lot of people have been talking about for a long time, sharing information at conferences, talking about on social media. Everyone sort of knew there were problems with data quality, but there wasn't a lot of good metrics for how big the problem was. So this group went to 3 or 4 different online platforms. They gathered about 1,000 people from each one, and then they simply described what percentage of participants they had to drop because of either signs of fraud, being repeat or duplicate participants, or providing unusable data for a number of different checks. And they came up with this number of between 30 to 40% of participants across the platforms that they looked at. Somewhat similarly, at CloudResearch, we have a data quality tool that's called Sentry. And a number of different companies that rely on market research panels will use Sentry. They'll have participants go through it before they enter a market research survey. And thanks to its kind of position and how it's used, we have hundreds of millions of people who pass through Sentry every year as a data quality tool. And we're able to see across these hundreds of different online platforms that are being used for research, across hundreds of millions of participants, numbers that match up with this 30 to 40% in terms of the percentage of people who show signs of fraud, who fail very simple attention check kind of questions, or who do other things that based on their location and other behaviors lead us to think that they're engaged in survey fraud. All right, so this number doesn't come from just a handful of kind of scattered studies. It's based on a number of different really large scale projects looking, just if you ask people in a specific survey across these platforms, you see a pretty high fail rate. And if you have multiple checks in there, you often get to this 30 to 40% number. If you look across specific platforms like Mechanical Turk that are being used and you track participants over the entire year, you come out to this number of about 40%. And if you look across hundreds of millions of participants in hundreds of different online research platforms, you again find this number of 30 to 40% who are failing very, very simple questions that you would expect people to be able to pass. So what causes these problems with data quality? Why is it that so many participants fail these very simple questions that we would expect them to pass? There are a number of problems that explain this that are sometimes interrelated. And one of them is this incentive participants often have in online surveys to engage in yay saying. So in case people are not familiar, yay saying is this term that's used to describe participants' tendency to basically say yes, to agree with items in online surveys, kind of regardless of the questionnaire or the content. In market research panels, participants are often screened at the beginning of a survey. They're asked to complete these different measures that assess whether they have experiences with certain products or certain characteristics. And over time, participants learn that saying yes to these kinds of screening questions allows them to qualify for studies more often than does saying no. And so participants have kind of a bit of a tendency to say yes to these kind of questions. They learn over time they can qualify for more studies by saying yes. A much bigger problem comes from what we call click farms. So these are organized groups of people, often outside of the country the researcher is interested in studying people in. And they use all kinds of tools to hide their location, like virtual private networks. They use these IP address rotators. They buy fake phone numbers or fake credentials for the participant site. And they infiltrate these platforms where surveys are being conducted, and they provide low quality or fraudulent data. There are actually all kinds of social media accounts you can find where there are people who act basically as influencers, and they teach other people how to make money in these online survey platforms. At CloudResearch, we've done a lot of investigation into these click farms over the last several years. We have video interviews that we've conducted with people and a number of different things where we've seen or found these videos and other materials on social media to understand the kinds of fraud that people are committing. So one problem is you have some number of participants who are likely to say yes, to maybe lie to screening questions to get into surveys. That can overlap with survey fraud that comes from click farms. But the third problem that causes these data quality issues is that platforms sometimes don't vet the way that you would need to in order to maintain data quality. And you can really see a history or an example of this when it comes to Mechanical Turk. I don't know how familiar people are with the background of Amazon's Mechanical Turk, but within academic social and behavioral sciences, it was one of the main platforms that were used for research from the time about 2010 or 2011 until 2018. Then in 2018, data quality on Mechanical Turk really plummeted. And at CloudResearch, we have all kinds of things that we put out over time, from some studies and blogs that we initially ran to video interviews, really explain what happened with this platform. And over time, Mechanical Turk simply wasn't interested in vetting participants the way that you would need to in order to maintain quality. And so these problems with data quality emerged on that platform. They grew, and because Mechanical Turk wasn't interested in vetting and excluding participants and doing some of the other things you would need to do to maintain quality, this platform is one that most researchers have turned away from and no longer use. And so all these problems that we see with click farms, with people outside of the country that the researcher wants to sample, they're all kind of encapsulated in this story of Mechanical Turk, where we have all kinds of different research studies that we have conducted and published explaining how the problems on that one platform also appear in other platforms with online research. So just summarizing that, we have this paper we recently published in Perspectives on Psychological Science that summarizes almost 10 years of our research into the problems with fraud and online research. And it really talks a lot about the research that we did on Mechanical Turk looking at this issue. If you're interested in reading this paper, you can scan this QR code. If for some reason you can't get access to it, you can feel free to contact our team. We'd be happy to share it with you. All right, so we understand a little bit about the problems with data quality that participants engage in yay saying. There are these click farms where people are outside of the target population and they're taking studies, maybe there are language issues. Let's talk quickly about some basic protection strategies, what we recommend researchers can do in online studies to catch these participants and to maintain data quality. One is to ask questions that capitalize on participants' yay-saying tendencies. So we saw some of these already. A question like, have you recently purchased a home in McMullen, Alabama? If participants have a tendency to say yes to that kind of question, and it looks like the kind of question that they're commonly asked to qualify for a survey, then building questions that capitalize on that behavioral tendency will allow you to detect and spot these participants. You can also ask about impossible scenarios. So in some research we've conducted in the past, we asked people if they have attended any live music shows at Shea Stadium in the last couple of years. Shea Stadium was demolished in 2009, and so anyone who says yes to a question like that today is either not paying attention or lying. In addition to these yay-saying questions, in order to know these questions are working, we have this strategy of benchmarking them against questions where we know the population rate for some item. So this research goes back a couple of years. where we could ask people, do you currently own a Tesla? And at the time, we knew the rate of that in the overall US population was about 4%. Each year, about 1% of the overall US population goes scuba diving. These are base rate numbers that you can find statistical evidence for that shows you how commonly people engage in these behaviors. In order to make sure that our yay-saying questions are really picking up on people who are providing poor quality data, we can compare the percentage of people who say yes in our yay-saying questions to the people who say no on these benchmarking items. And what we see is that people who say yes to yay-saying questions often also say yes to these benchmarking questions. So they say yes, they've gone scuba diving in the last year at a much higher rate than people who pass the yay-saying questions. If you are developing your own attention checks or your own ways to measure quality within a survey, it's often important to benchmark them against some population information like this. The other thing that we recommend a lot is to ask people open-ended questions, especially if you're asking people about some experience or some group that they belong to, something where they should be able to explain some background about it. We often recommend combining these yay-saying questions with an open-ended response. We have a study that we published a couple of years ago looking at people who said they drank bleach or used cleaning products in dangerous ways during the COVID-19 pandemic. This was in response to a paper that was published by the CDC saying that about 40% of Americans were using cleaning products in very dangerous ways. We asked people the same sort of questions. Have you used this product? Did you do this thing with it? And after people said yes, we would then ask them to specifically explain. So if people told us yes, that they drank bleach, we would ask them, explain what happened. What was the scenario? Why did you do this? What was the result? And when we ask that sort of open-ended validation, asking people to explain what happened, we would often see that people would reveal they were actually confused about the question, they didn't fully read it, or they used some cleaning products in a way that was different from the way the question was intended to ask. So these open-ended questions can help you really understand or verify the things that people say in a closed-ended question. And then finally, the last thing that we recommend in these online studies is setting some kind of threshold for where you're going to decide to exclude people or where you're going to decide that their quality is low enough that you're not going to keep them in your analysis. And this again goes back to the kind of fit for purpose framework that we talked about earlier. Sometimes you can choose to be more strict in the data quality that you're going to accept. And sometimes you can let people fail, let's say, one of these questions. In the book, we actually walk through how setting this threshold affects all kinds of different outcome measures. But if you're conducting, let's say, a descriptive research project, again, where you simply want to describe how often people do something or the percentage of people who believe something is true, that data is much more susceptible to the influence of people who are engaged in yay-saying or providing low-quality data than something in an experiment where there are lots of participants and you're looking at group averages. So some studies can tolerate more noise than others. Some studies are exploratory. Others are more seeking to confirm a hypothesis. And anytime it's really, really important to make sure people are paying attention and doing a good job and that you're gathering high quality data, you can set a more strict threshold, requiring people to say, pass all of your attention checks. Instead of if the study is more exploratory or you have a little bit more room for tolerance, you can let people fail maybe one or two of these questions. And then this is just a quick illustration of that benchmarking principle that I was talking about. You can see here in this figure, we have 3 different platforms that we collected data from. Participants are marked as either unreliable or reliable based on whether or not they passed our yay-saying or attention check questions. So if people failed more than one of those yay-saying questions, they go into the unreliable group. If they pass them all or failed just one, they're in the reliable group. And you can see here the outcome that we're looking at is, have you gone scuba diving within the past 12 months? Overall, we know about 1% of people in the US population do that each year. And what you can see is that among people who fail those yay-saying questions, they say yes to this question at a rate that's almost 20 times higher than people who pass or say no to those yay-saying questions. If you weren't measuring data quality overall in the sample, you can see the full sample. It would make it look like these rare behaviors are much more common than they really are. And that's exactly a demonstration of the kind of problems that I mean for descriptive studies. Let's say you're not asking about scuba diving within the last year, but support for some politician, support for political violence, something where you're just simply counting up the number of people who say yes or no to some question. If you're not measuring data quality, those numbers can be dramatically inflated by people who are yay saying in the survey. Okay, so I think that brings us to our break. We'll take about a 5 or 10-minute break. I realized some of the questions and the polling took a little bit longer earlier than I expected. So we'll step away. I know it says 10 minutes here, but we'll step away for 5 minutes until about 1:47. And if you can, while you have this short break, think about attention check questions that you might use in your research. And really, these questions operate best when they kind of blend in with the topic of the survey. You can write down any questions that have come up so far about the platforms or about data quality. And if you want to get a head start for the demo that we're about to conduct, you can actually go to the CloudResearch website and log into Connect. When we come back, I'll walk through how to set up and launch a study on Connect. All right, so we'll take about a 5-minute break and come back at about 1:47. All right, so back from a quick break, I shared a few resources in the chat that someone had asked for, a link to the preview of our book on our webpage, a reminder, the official version coming out from Cambridge should be out this summer. We're working through page proofs and the production process with them now. And also a link to the Perspectives on Psychological Science article covering almost 10 years of our research into fraud and problems with online data quality. If you cannot access that, you can feel free to email us. I think we have a preprint up on the Open Science Framework. If that's out of date, we'd be happy to email you the latest version. So now we're going to move into the fourth part, which is the live demo of how to set up a study on Connect. Just to give you a quick overview before I switch my screen over to Connect. First, we're going to take a look at the researcher dashboard, learn a little bit about how to navigate Connect and some of the different options that are there. Then we'll jump into the process of creating a study. We'll go through what kind of basic information you can provide to participants, where you put a link to your study, where you as the researcher actually go in, determine how many participants it is that you want and how much you want to pay them. We'll look at options for demographic targeting, and then briefly cover some launch and what to do after the study is live. If you have questions along the way, keep them in mind. I'd be happy to answer them as soon as we get to the question and answer session here. If you've used a site like Connect before, hopefully this overview can point out a few features of the website that maybe you weren't familiar with before. So when you first log in as a researcher, you'll see a dashboard that looks like this. The dashboard will be blank if you've never run a study before. And along the side here, on the left-hand side, there are some tabs or options for different things that you can do. So there's the conversation center that I mentioned earlier. If you want to send participants a message, there's actually an email system here. You can send individual messages out to people, or if you're, let's say, following up with an entire group of people, you can send bulk messages that might be reminding 50 or 100 people, hey, that there's this second wave of data collection that we're about to launch. There are a few different ways you can fund your account to pay for studies. You can work together with other people by transferring funds. There's just a few options along the left-hand side there. The main thing that you want to do from the dashboard, you can see a study when it's live. You can see how data collection is going. You get some different pieces of information about how many people have completed the study, how many people are actively engaged in it at the moment, and how many people have started the study but left for some reason, what we call the bounce rate. And all this information can be helpful. You might intervene if something's going wrong, but most of the time what you're going to do is come over here to the Create a Project button. And often you're going to choose that you want to create a survey. Waves is an option for helping automate the work of a longitudinal or tracking study over time, you can punch in some parameters, and rather than having to create lots of manual studies, you can have those automatically created for you. We also have people that do some data labeling and other kinds of tasks, but the option most people go with is this survey option that allows you to set up a basic study on our site. And then you simply walk through these 5 steps that we'll go through in order. The first thing you do is you give your project a name or a title. We have 2 options here. One is a public-facing title, what the participants are actually going to see as they're searching for studies on our site. And then most research teams have some kind of shorthand, something internal that they use when they are creating studies. I just quickly saw that there's a question asking if this session is going to be recorded, and the answer is yeah, we record this, and we'll also make it available to all attendees afterwards. So you give your project some title. If you want to use this internal thing to help keep track, some shorthand of the projects, you can do that as well. And then there are 2 boxes where you can describe to participants what it is they need to do. Both of these are optional, so you don't have to put anything here, but it might be helpful. So in a short survey, let's say people are filling out personality questionnaires, or they're responding to something about a product, you might simply write a sort of nondescript explanation of answer questions about personality, or look at a product and answer some questions. Right? Just a very short, giving people an idea of what the study's about and what they're going to be asked to do. If the study is more complicated, let's say it's one of those mock jury trials that I talked about earlier, or it's a study where they need to download some reaction time software, or it's a longitudinal project where they need to come back, or they actually need to get into a video call on Zoom and interact with a researcher or another participant. Anything that goes beyond the norm of a study where you would kind of quickly complete it as a participant, this special instructions box allows you to communicate that information to people upfront. Now, people who are reading this information are trying to decide, is this a project that I want to participate in or not? And so it's best to keep this short and concise. You don't want like a consent form level of description here. You don't want paragraph after paragraph that people are going to have to read. You want to quickly let them know this is what the study requires if you want to get paid and do this project, and allow them to decide, do I want to do this? Do I have the time to do this right now? Am I comfortable appearing on camera, right? Informing them about what this project is about. So for a longitudinal study where people need to come back, what we would often recommend is saying this is a longitudinal study. 2 weeks later, there's going to be this follow-up. Today requires 15 minutes. Next week requires 2 weeks from now requires 15 minutes. And here's what you're going to get. You're going to get $2 for completing time 1, $5 for coming back next week. This could all be communicated with bullet points. Again, the point is to allow a participant to decide, do I have the time to do this right now? And is this a project that I'm interested in doing? This really helps for difficult projects, for kind of like weeding out people who either can't or aren't interested in committing to the project from people who are and they understand the requirements. So that's really what this special instructions box is used for. Some other basic information options, you can limit the device that people are on. So if you have a study that you want to make sure people are on some kind of desktop or laptop instead of a mobile device, you can control that. You can communicate just little signals to people that, hey, this project requires you to download some reaction time software onto your device. I want you to be aware of that up front and make sure that you're comfortable opting into that. You can also let them know if they need to hear audio or if they need to write, right? Just a number of different other basic options. The second step in setting up a project is to add a link to your survey or project or website, whatever it is that you want the participants to do. You simply paste a link in here. For most people, that is a Qualtrics link, but it can be any third-party survey or URL. We have some instructions that help you collect people's participant ID automatically. So if you're familiar with embedded data and your survey platform supports this, you can find a set of instructions here that will show you how to set that up and automatically collect their participant ID. If you don't know what I'm talking about or you're not familiar with this, you can just ask people in the survey, please paste in your Connect participant ID. They'll go and they can easily paste this in. At CloudResearch, we have our own survey platform that we've created called Engage. Engage works seamlessly with Connect. It allows you to use AI through a number of different pieces of the research process, especially with asking people open-ended data and then analyzing that. If that's something that you'd be interested in, we will have other workshops about that in the future. We'd be happy to give you a demo, show you how that works, but Engage is one of the survey platforms you can choose here, along with instructions for lots of other common ones. So let's say you have a link to your survey or project. You paste it in here. This is what's going to be given to participants when they start. They're going to click on it. They're going to leave Connect, the Connect environment. They're going to go into your survey, complete whatever it is you want them to do, and later they'll get directed back to Connect. The next step is to enter information about how many participants you want to recruit, how much you plan to pay them, and how long you think the study is going to take them to complete. So I'm just going to punch in some numbers. Let's say we're going to recruit 250 people. Let's say we think the study is going to take them 15 minutes. There are some norms for payment on Connect. We recommend payment of about, I think our baseline is $7.50 per hour. The recommended amount is about $10 per hour. That's about the norm of what most researchers pay. So for a 10 to 15-minute study, which is about average, each participant's getting in the ballpark of $2. When the study becomes more complicated, people are giving up more privacy, doing something that's more difficult, it's helpful to increase the payment to give them the proper incentive. But you can move this around here. You get a slider that shows you kind of where you are in relation to norms on the platform. So let's say that you've said you want 250 participants. It's going to take 15 minutes for them each to complete the study, and you're going to pay each person $2.50. There's a cost calculator here on the side that can show you how changing these different parameters affect the overall cost of your study. Pretty simple. You decide how much you want to pay people. There are some recommendations about a minimum per hour sort of rate that people should be compensated. But if you have specific questions about a study that you're conducting and you want to know what is a strong incentive, what's going to motivate people to come back, you can always reach out to us with those kinds of questions. We'd be happy to provide recommendations based on our experience. All right, so we've entered basic information. We've put a link to the project. We've gone through some of the different options for how many people and how much we want to pay them. One of the areas within Connect where there are really lots of different options for taking studies in a different direction is the demographic targeting. So we have hundreds and hundreds of different characteristics that we have already profiled our participants on. You can use these characteristics to target your study towards people with specific demographic characteristics. So most of the participants on Connect are from the United States. There's some in these other predominantly English-speaking countries. But beyond country, we have asked people, all kinds of different questions about different technology that they use, different work questions, things about lifestyle. You can see there are hundreds of different characteristics here. That's common to most online research platforms. What makes Connect a little bit different is that as a researcher, you can also request a demographic. So let's say that there's some characteristic that you want to sample participants on, and you don't see that already in our system. You can click this request a demographic button, and then give us the question text and the answer options exactly as you want them to appear to the participants. We'll review this question, and then we'll put it into our system. Usually within 3 or 4 days, we have 10 to 15,000 people who will answer this question, and then we'll make those people who are qualified available to you as a researcher. This is one way you could do demographic targeting on Connect. We'll cover another in just a second. Beyond just targeting people with specific characteristics, you can also build quotas on Connect. So you can apply a census match template. If you just click this, you'll automatically get quotas that are matched to the US Census numbers for age, race and ethnicity, gender, and maybe one other characteristic, but certainly for gender, age, race, and ethnicity. You can then add region of the country if you want, but these automatically get applied in proportion to numbers from the last US Census. You can then also build your own custom quotas. So let's say that an example here, there's a question about work. It could be industry of employment. It could be, do you work from home or do you work in an office? But once you have some qualification question, a demographic characteristic that you select to target participants on, you can then build your own custom quotas. So you might want 50% of people who work in an office 5 days a week and 50% of people who work at home or some kind of hybrid. You can go in and build these own quotas yourself. So really extensive demographic targeting options here on Connect. There's kind of a lot more that you can do here, but that's a basic overview of there are lots of questions that we've asked participants. You can suggest your own, and then any characteristic that you are targeting people on, you can also build your own custom quotas. So let's say you've completed the demographic targeting. The last thing to do is to set up how people are going to complete the study. The most basic completion process is, as I mentioned again, participants are on Connect. They click a link to your survey. They leave Connect. They go to Qualtrics or whatever third-party survey it is. And then at the end of the survey, you want them to come back to Connect so they get marked as complete and you can review their data. The easiest way to do that is to give them either a code on the last page of the survey they complete, tell them to paste that into Connect to just give you evidence they went all the way through the survey, or what is much more common is people use a redirect URL. If your survey platform allows it, you can just program things so that anyone who hits that last page automatically gets directed back to this URL that we give you. You can see it begins with Connect and it marks the participant as complete, and then you can review that participant. This gets a little bit complicated, but it's a useful setting for a lot of people. You can also build what we call branches within completion. So let's say you're running a study where you want to screen people at the beginning, like we talked about earlier. You want to find people who meet some kind of characteristic that it's best to ask actually in the survey. Work arrangement is one of these good examples, that people's work arrangement, whether they're in the office full-time or hybrid or fully remote, can change a lot faster than they're going to log into a participant platform and update their data or information. So a lot of times it might be a good idea to screen people at the start of that survey. You can actually add branches that allow you to ask those kinds of screening questions up front. You set up so that anyone who's not qualified gets some small amount of compensation, let's say 10 cents or something for answering your couple of questions, and then they actually get screened out of the survey, and everyone else who is qualified can continue and have a different end of survey experience that marks them as complete. We have other researchers who run different kinds of studies where they're interested in participants' effort over time. Do they persist on some kind of task? And you might want to set up these different endpoints and pay people who continue in the survey, who continue to do more task or effort or work, right, more money. There's all kinds of different reasons you might want to have different endpoints, and that's basically what this completion branches allow you to do. We have knowledge bases to help make some of this a little bit more clear to show you exactly how it can be used, but you can set up custom endpoints for different participants. So let's say you've gone through these 5 steps. You've given participants some basic information about what they're going to do. You've pasted in a link to your project. You've decided how much you're going to pay people and how many you want to recruit. You've set up your demographic targeting and you've completed the end of study options. You then save the project. It will appear on your dashboard. And when you want to go to launch, there are these 3 little buttons over here. You can you can click it and it will give you a number of different launch options. So you can choose to launch the project right away. You can schedule some future launch time, like tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I want this study to go live. And when you go through the launch process, you can choose to launch the study right now, open it up to everybody, or we have a built-in pilot feature, which is actually incredibly useful. So you might decide, I'm going to run a study for 250 participants just to make sure everything's working properly and that participants understand things and there's no problem in how I've created the survey. I want to open it up to just 5 or 10 people to begin with. I want to let them complete the survey and make sure there's no problem, the data is being recorded correctly, and then I'll open it up to everyone else. We have a pilot system built in that allows you to do that. You just say the number of people that you want to open up your pilot study for. You click launch. It opens up to those 5 or 10 people. You get a notification once that pilot is complete. You can check the data, make sure everything's working properly, and then you click a button to just continue the full launch. We highly, highly recommend using this option. Sometimes researchers will set up an online study. Let's say it's for 500 people. As soon as you click launch, we send out emails to people in our system who are qualified to take that study. And if it's a pretty broad group of participants, 500 people could be active in your study within a matter of minutes. If there's some kind of mistake or something that's not properly programmed, not only are people not going to be able to complete the study, but 500 people are going to be submitting their project and all run into the same problem. So a study can really, really quickly be ruined. It's worth the time to conduct one of these pilot projects, and we've made it very seamless to do that. The last thing I'll show you before we get into the question and answer session is that when a project is live, there, if you click on it, there's the option to manage the participants. You'll see some different stats for the project, how long it's taking people on average, people who have bounced from the project, some other kind of summary characteristics here. But if you scroll down, here's the page where you actually manage the participants. You decide, after looking at your data, who you're going to approve and who, for whatever reason, let's say they have not done a good job, you're going to reject from the project. If you reject a participant, they don't get paid, and you retain the money for that person. When you approve people, they get paid. And if you just set up things as normal and you don't intervene here, there's an auto approval feature within 14 days. So within 14 days after somebody has submitted a survey in your project, if you don't take action, they'll be auto approved. But before that time, you have the option to review their data to make sure the participant gave a good effort to try to do whatever it is you asked them to do in the survey, and then to make decisions about approving and rejecting participants. All right, so that's an overview of some of the things that I mentioned earlier about researcher-centric platforms, how they really put researchers in control of all these different decisions about demographic targeting, how the study is going to be set up, how to explain it to participants, how much they're going to receive for the study, and then actually all the way through to the process of approving and rejecting participants after looking at the data. All right, so that brings us to the question and answer session of today's workshop. And there's a couple of different ways that we can do this session. People can put questions into the chat, or you can use the question and answer tab across the top. Or if you're comfortable, you should also have the ability to either turn on your mic or your camera and go back and forth and have kind of a natural conversation. But I'd be happy to answer any questions people have about platforms, data quality, setting up studies, or anything specific to your research. So I see a question in the chat that asks, is it possible to use Lime Survey with Connect? I'm not specifically familiar with Lime Survey, but my hunch and strong guess is that yes, any third-party platform will work, any survey tool. You can direct participants, and the reason why any survey tool works is that participants can click on your link and go to any survey platform. Once they leave Connect, they go to your survey tool. The main difference that comes up is what your survey tool allows. Some survey tools allow researchers to do much more complicated things. Some are much simpler. You can direct people to Google Forms, right, and just have them answer a number of basic questions there. A more sophisticated survey tool like Qualtrics allows you to collect all this data, embedded data that participants don't see. They give you all these options for screening people out and using redirects. The survey tool really matters a lot more for what you're in control of as a researcher, what you can get your participants to do. But Lime Survey, RedCap, any of these survey platforms, you can put a link in there, and the participants, when they click on it, they go to your survey environment. So all of them are compatible with Connect. You can send participants to any site. The only limitations you might bump into are if you're using like the branching system, that not every survey platform will allow you to have multiple redirect links, and some things that get a little bit more complicated. But for a basic survey, you can send Connect participants anywhere you want. So I see a question, someone asked, could I talk a little bit more about the survey tool that CloudResearch offers and what differentiates it? Yes, I can. Let me do one thing while I do that. So most people are familiar with survey tools. We work with a lot of academics. A lot of academics work with Qualtrics. Our survey tool, Engage, is like these other survey platforms, but really built for the era of AI and how that's changing research. So it has a number of data quality protections built into it. We'll get into this in the data quality masterclass, where you can see not just the answer participants give to a question, like let's say a yay-saying question that we went over, but you can also see what's going on their device and how they're answering the question. Looking at what's happening on the participant's device and how they're navigating the survey turns out to be one of the really important features for determining whether or not the participant is actually human or using one of these AI agents to complete the survey, which people have a lot of concern about. So it has these data quality defenses built into it. But then on the researcher side, you can use Engage to facilitate, you can use the AI within Engage to facilitate all kinds of steps of the research process. So you can upload a Word document with your questionnaire or your experiment, and you can get Engage to program the full survey with the questions, any randomization or branch logic, all these different things. It will program it basically automatically. As you're conducting the survey, a lot of times we'll ask a closed-ended quantitative question, right? Do you agree or disagree, strongly like, any kind of question like that. Engage allows you to then use the AI to follow up and ask people to explain why they gave that rating. This isn't a goal of all research, but in cases where it is useful, you can really find out differences in how people are understanding the question. You can get a much deeper look into how they're thinking about whatever it is that you've asked them to consider. And not only do you get this kind of really rich qualitative open-ended data when people are responding to having what we call conversational surveys with the AI, but then you can use the AI to also analyze that data. For a lot of researchers, right, myself included, I'm a quantitative social and experimental psychologist. We often don't work with qualitative data historically because it's a very slow process. You have to make sense of all these transcripts. The AI really facilitates a lot of that to where you can conduct mixed methods or qualitative research really at scale. And there's a lot that goes into this, of course, how you program the AI, what kinds of questions. We have a whole team that gives demos on that. Would be happy to share a lot more. But for a very kind of quick and I think exciting overview of what Engage does, I'm actually going to share in the chat right now a link to a presentation I gave at a conference 2 months ago, really going over some studies that I had run as a graduate student that we then reran with Engage, and just showing how much faster and not just speed, but how much deeper we were able to understand participants and their thinking and what they were doing within our study. Of where Engage can be useful in each step of the research process. So I see another question here where someone asked if I could talk a little bit more about waves or how CloudResearch can be used for EMA experience methods data collection. Yeah, so I'd be happy to do that. Within Connect, when we were setting up a study, Waves is one of the options that's available there. And what Waves really does is, as I mentioned, it automates the practice of setting up multiple studies. There's really a great story that we had a researcher who contacted us. She said, I want to run kind of like a not quite an EMA study, but a daily diary sort of study where I want to sample people basically at 9 o'clock in the morning, 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and like 6 o'clock at night. And I want to do that for like 20 something days in a row. That would have meant manually creating 90 something surveys within the platform and then setting up a launch time and just a lot of manual work to this one goes live on Monday, this one goes live on Tuesday. What Waves allows you to do is punch in a few parameters, right? That I want to sample people 3 times a day for this time period, and all those projects get automatically created. So it saves you a lot of time and effort and setting up when they're going to go live. It then helps you track when participants complete those different waves. So a lot of times, as an incentive, researchers will say if you complete 75% of these surveys, you'll be eligible for some bonus. It might then take a lot of time and effort to look, okay, this participant ID was here and across 30 different data sets. It becomes just a complicated, time-consuming task. Waves will allow you to track, which participants met whatever threshold, automate giving them bonuses. I don't think this is there quite yet, but our team is working on also being able to automate all the reminder emails. So for an EMA sort of study, it would be a little bit overkill, but for some other kind of longitudinal projects, let's say it's a month or a couple weeks in between data collection, we would often recommend that you remind participants a day or two before the data collection. Just as a reminder, you're in this longitudinal study, and tomorrow at 12 o'clock, we're going to launch wave 2. Then that email would go out when the study actually goes live. They would get a notification, and then you can also send reminder follow-up emails then. For an EMA study where you really want to then respond right away, what might be useful is a reminder, like let's say the study is going to be open for an hour or two, whatever window, and you want to make sure people complete it as quickly as possible. You can then automate some reminder messages that if they didn't get the initial email when the project goes live, you can say as a reminder, this window is closing within an hour or whatever, and we're trying to like push the data collection. So we're working on automating all of that. Right now, you can manually send those kinds of reminder emails, but Waves will have the ability to do that as well. And it might be a great thing if we just have like more of a conversation outside of this. Our team has been also doing some stuff with text message notifications to participants. Right now, most of the things, the conversation center through Connect operates through email, but there's some other ways that we've been contacting participants. And so for an EMA study, it might be useful just to have a chat, understand a little bit more about what it is you want participants to do and how to best set that up on the platform, or explore whether it's compatible. So there's a question that asks, do Connect participants go through Sentry automatically? So this is a good question. I didn't get into Sentry a whole lot in this workshop or webinar. Sentry is used in kind of a number of different ways. When people sign up on Connect, we put them through a longer vetting process. When people are kind of in that market research environment and they're just getting screened before they get into a survey, what researchers often need is some kind of quick screener to remove fraud. And it might take 60 seconds or something for people to go through that. The same technology that we use in Sentry to look at what's going on people's device and some of the same kinds of questions that we ask to detect fraud are also asked as a part of the Connect onboarding. So we often think of Sentry as more of a pre-survey screener that's used in the market research. That's where it's most appropriate. People go through something similar, but more extensive on the Connect side of things. And then after people are on our site, let's say they get through the initial onboarding process, they submit the ID verification, and they start taking some surveys. We get feedback from researchers, and we continue to monitor their behavior by opening up different surveys. So there's a lot of really extensive vetting that people on Connect go through, not just to get on the site, but also once they're on there. So just as a clarification, Sentry is used for, like, if you're sampling from our Prime Panels platform, we do put participants through Sentry before every study. We don't put participants from Connect through Sentry before every study. And that kind of goes back to that fit for purpose framework that I was talking about. We do a lot more extensive vetting on Connect. We know from our studies and independent ones that the data quality is much higher at a baseline level, that we don't need to screen people before every single survey. We have ongoing surveys that we do. We have feedback sort of mechanisms. Again, researchers can share information. There's a lot of other ways we can monitor people on Connect. But because Prime Panels is this much more, because of the aggregation, it's much more piecemeal. Participants are coming from lots of different places. There's a lot of turnover. It's just a very different environment. It's hard to do that same level of vetting for tens of millions of people. And because there's turnover, it probably wouldn't be worth it nearly as much. So Sentry is a way to vet people before they get into these surveys when you're taking them from lots of different sources.
If it's all right, sorry, this is Beth. I'll just jump in really quick. Follow-up question. So in reading through the materials, I got the impression that that Sentry was really the, I guess maybe the most extensive vetting process. In listening to the responses, it actually sounds more like the vetting process for Connect might actually be more extensive than Sentry. Am I hearing that right?
I see. So I think it's a little bit about the context that it's being deployed in. Sentry is it's the most extensive form of vetting that you can do in the market research space. So there's a number of competitors, there's a number of other ways that these market research panels vet their participants, often relying on sort of technical checks. You can very clearly see that they're not effective enough by just running a survey on these platforms, that there are these problems with data quality that everyone in the market research space kind of openly talks about. And so Sentry is a behavioral check. We look at what people are saying to these questions, as well as what's going on their device. And that's where the messaging and things about extensive embedding comes from. On Connect, we're able to just put people through so many more layers of vetting. So it's not like they're being kind of deployed in different ways. We use the same technology, but we can have people go through, multiple rounds, and they're just kind of, because they're such different environments. But Sentry is extensive in the fact that we're looking both at behaviors and how people are answering. We're looking at their device. There's hundreds of different kind of signals that our team is looking at on the back end, in terms of each person gets like a unique fingerprint for their device and their participant account, and all these things get tracked. So it is very extensive in combining both all these technical checks that are kind of standard, that do something but are not sufficient, with these behavioral checks that also add a layer on top of that.
Okay, great. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so I think we have just a couple more minutes here. If anyone has other questions, I'm happy to answer. Before we wrap up, share just a few more kind of next steps that people can take. Make sure I didn't miss any questions in the question and answer. All right, if you did have a question that we didn't get to, we will look through the chat and some of these different things after we're done. We'll be happy to follow up with you by email. But let me finish by just directing you to a few resources and some next steps that you can take. So I know early on that most people attending said they have collected some online data before, and they've also participated in studies before. That's great. If you don't have a Connect account and you're interested in using it, you can sign up at CloudResearch. When you create a Connect account, normally the way things operate on Connect is you decide how much you want to pay your participants. We charge a service fee, which is a percentage of that. It's 25% for academic researchers, 40% for businesses and other nonprofit organizations. We waive that service fee for the first 10 days after you sign up. So that begins when you start running studies, but you can sign up, create an account, explore the platform, look at some of the options for taking studies. And if you are more interested in have questions, we have lots and lots of resources. So we have not only the book that I mentioned, our team has published somewhere between 20 and 25 different papers and chapters. We have a extensive knowledge base that shows you answers to common questions like how do I set this up or how do I do this different thing. We'd be happy to schedule a demo or a meeting where someone could walk through the setup with you again or answer specific questions about your project. A good example of how these meetings go is someone asked about an EMA experience sampling study earlier, or someone has a longitudinal study. They want to go ask some questions about how best to set that up and describe it, and get some answers to how to structure compensation to make sure participants stay involved and engaged. We'd be happy to have those kinds of conversations. We also have a blog where we have lots of different information that explains problems with data quality, shows you how to do things. So as a whole, our team has lots of resources that you can read or that would guide you through things. We're also happy to meet with people. We'll also, you can also keep an eye out for the other webinars that we have. So I mentioned next week we have a data quality masterclass. We're going to talk a lot more about how we uncovered some of these problems with fraud, how we developed some of the solutions that we've come up with, and get a lot more into the problems with AI agents and the concern that people have with that and research now. We also regularly give webinars on data quality and AI agents, kind of not as extensive of a class, but for different groups. And we'd be happy to meet with you or to answer any questions if you reach out. So thank you again for joining us, everyone. We'll send along a recording and follow up with you after today's workshop. But thanks for your time and thank you for being with us.